When I was 5, my grandfather took me out on the lake for the first time. It's been over 30 years since that day, but I'll never forget it. I had my little perch pole, and he was after pike. I hooked a tiny little perch that got eaten by a monster pike, and ripped the pole from my hands before I could even blink. Grandpa pulled out an old rod that had to be my dad's from when he was my age, and gave the reel a few cranks to make sure it still worked. We fished the rest of the day and even managed to land a few keepers. This became tradition when I'd visit during the summer. My grandparents lived on the southern shore of Lake Superior. I lived a few hours south, and during summer break my parents and I would go north to visit for a week or two. Grandpa was really the only person who liked to fish, and well, of course myself. Grandpa would never go out on the lake if it was rough, however, and if he thought it looked like it might get rough, he turned back or wouldn't even get out of the dock in the first place. One bright and sunny day when I was 9, we were on the boat ready to go when he said, "It just didn't feel right." We unloaded the boat and stayed inside playing cards. Within minutes, a freak thunderstorm pounded the area with high winds and several inches of rain. By the time we could see through the thick curtain of rain to the water's edge, it was apparent that Grandpa had made the right call. The swells were easily 4 feet high and were tossing the tiny boat back and forth at the dock. Later that day, as the wind finally died down, a call came in across the radio about a small fishing boat that had gone missing. Grandpa and Dad jumped in the boat and joined the search. Around dusk, they finally returned. Dad looked rough. He was shivering, pale, and soaked. Mom put a warm blanket on him and gave him a cup of coffee. I found out later that Dad had been in the water for nearly an hour with a few other guys trying to help the trapped fisherman whose boat had capsized. Surprisingly, they did actually get him out, but apparently he was completely crazy. He'd locked himself into the small cabin of the boat, away from the steering wheel, and hidden himself in a compartment under the seats while the storm had its way with his boat. No one could get a straight answer out of him. Dad was the one that ended up fishing him out of the water. They ran an anchor line down to his boat and had to forcibly drag him from the cabin as the air bubble began to collapse. He went into shock almost as soon as he made it to the surface, and before they made it to the shore, he was dead. Dad was borderline hypothermic and sat in a warm shower for a few hours afterwards. Grandpa pulled me aside the next day and told me a story. When he was a young man, before my dad was born, he was out fishing on the lake. He was in 50 feet of crystal clear water above an old wreck that had been hauling iron ore. It was his favorite spot, despite the fact that he knew that not everyone had survived the wreck. The fog had obscured his view for most of the day, but he knew his way around the water, and since they were mirror flat, he couldn't pass up the perfect fishing day. It was also apparent early on, however, that the fish weren't biting. He moved several times and tried all over the wreck, but couldn't land a fish. Finally, he spotted something on the water near where he'd initially been fishing. He was a few hundred yards away, but it looked like a tree floating vertically in the water. He decided to investigate. The fish weren't biting and the fog still wasn't lifting. As soon as he drew closer to the object, he quickly felt something tell him to stop. He slammed the boat into reverse to back away, but suddenly the object was gone. He wondered if it had sunk or flipped, or maybe his instinct told him to steer clear so that he didn't hit it. He quickly moved back to the wheel and opened throttle wide to get home. As soon as he looked up, the thing was right in front of him. It wasn't a tree. He swerved to avoid it and kept his eyes off of the water. Grandpa was shaking a little as he told me. He said that he knew it was still with him the entire way home. He couldn't look forward, he couldn't check his bearings, and had to basically rely on his intimate knowledge of the lake to guide him home. Instead of docking his boat, he simply beached it to get to land quicker. He kept his eyes down and jumped from the boat as it struck the rocky beach. He made it inside, but he could feel it just outside until the fog lifted. He never told Grandma for fear she'd want to move. That, however, is how Grandpa knew when to not go out on the water. He said the incident gave him a sixth sense. He wouldn't tell me what it looked like, but he had heard of some old Native American tribes that had a superstition about a demon man that could walk on water. If you looked at it for too long, it would drive you mad, or it could take your soul and keep you trapped in the water forever, and eventually, you would become one as well. He told me he thought that the man had seen it too, and perhaps he'd looked for too long. Honestly, at that exact moment, it scared the crap out of me. But as the week went on, things returned to normal, and eventually I got to go fishing again. The whole experience kind of faded quickly as time went on. We went home, and a year basically flew by. Suddenly, we were back at my grandpa's on vacation. I had completely forgotten about it, and this trip was special. This time, the trip fell on my birthday. For a present, Grandpa had bought me a brand new pole and was taking me out on the lake. The day started out great. We were out on the water at first light and there was absolutely no wind. The air was cool and refreshing. A low fog hung over the water, but didn't really obscure visibility enough to be an annoyance. Grandpa, however, didn't seem at ease. We were at my favorite spot, an abandoned coal dock where I'd hooked my biggest perch and only keeper pike to date. Grandpa was barely watching his pole, and finally he ended up just pulling his line in and watching me. Finally, I looked up after realizing that I hadn't had a bite or even a nibble all morning. Grandpa was pale. He was staring at my bobber about 20 feet from the boat, and he very calmly told me that we needed to leave. He grabbed my pole and quickly reeled in the line and laid it down on the boat. He told me not to look at the water. At this point, I started to remember the story he'd told me. I didn't know what else to do, so I listened exactly. I stared directly at my feet while Grandpa methodically got the boat running and headed back towards the dock. I could feel the vibration of the boat chattering my teeth as Grandpa pushed the engine of the boat to its limit. We were going so fast that Grandpa had to swerve back and forth a little to avoid small islands that we'd normally check for perch. As he did so, I saw it for the first time. I was still looking down, but the sudden lurching of the boat caused me to shift position, and out of the corner of my eye, I could see something following us at the same speed as the boat. I could see that it had the same general shape as a person, but it was gray and brown, and I couldn't make out a face, but I heard my grandfather suddenly yell, "Don't look!" as I quickly averted my eyes. Once we got home, Grandpa steered for the wrong side of the dock. He turned in one motion and quickly put me on the bow of the boat. As he cut the engine abruptly while the boat was going full speed, I could suddenly hear everything. He quickly explained what was about to happen. "When the boat hits land, you need to jump. Run inside. Don't wait for me. I'll be right behind you. Go inside and don't look out the windows. Do you understand?" I really only had time to briefly nod yes before the boat slammed into the sandy shore. I realized many years later that Grandpa had actually dredged a small crash landing spot out so that there wouldn't be rocks to wreck his boat for just such an occasion. I was airborne and had the wind knocked out of me when I hit the ground. I felt the strong arms of my grandfather pick me up and shove me in the direction of the house. I was inside before I knew what had happened, but Grandpa didn't come in. My parents had taken Grandma into town to do some grocery shopping and had left a note saying the time they'd be back. I waited in the back of the house, close to the garage, for half an hour until they returned. My dad found Grandpa collapsed on the beach only a few feet from the boat. He was unconscious and barely breathing. I tried to explain to my parents what had happened, but no one seemed to believe me. They simply thought he had a heart attack. He was nearing 70 at this point. Dad drove him to the hospital with Grandma while I stayed home with Mom, and she patched up a few cuts and bruises that I'd acquired upon my rough landing. Grandpa lived, but the doctor said he'd had a heart attack, and while he was in the hospital, he'd had a stroke. He would never be the same. Dad took it pretty hard. It's not easy to see your own personal Superman struck down in front of your very eyes. Grandma stayed pretty quiet and kept to herself as she normally did. No one fished on the lake anymore. As the years passed, Grandpa eventually caught a bad cold that turned to pneumonia. He passed very quickly in his sleep one night. Grandma moved to an assisted living facility near our house where she lived for another 2 decades before she passed away last week. As my parents went through the will, they found out that Grandpa and Grandma never sold the property on the lake, but that they'd been having it maintained by a small private cleaning service, and had willed the property and boat to me. My dad was the only child, and so was I, so it wasn't a huge surprise, except for the fact that everyone had assumed that the land had been long since sold off. I decided to spend a week there. I couldn't afford to maintain it on my own. I lived in a different state altogether at this point, and my only real choice was to sell it, but that didn't mean I couldn't spend a little time there first. The boat still ran just fine. It was dated, but kept in good working order by the same people who looked after the house. I got some bait and took the boat out to the old coal docks. I hadn't fished in years, but it was so relaxing. I almost felt like Grandpa was there with me. Then I realized how quiet everything was. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up and almost felt Grandpa saying, "You need to leave, now." I hadn't been on the water for more than half an hour, but I knew I needed to go. The fog had rolled in while I was setting up my pole, and I hadn't even seen it at first. I set my pole down and had the boat almost turned around to go home when I saw it. It was so close I couldn't help but get a good look at it. The thing wore what appeared to be tattered brown rags and had the general shape of a human, but that's where the similarities ceased. It probably stood close to 9 feet tall, but it was hunched over so that its height was more in the area of 6 feet. It had huge clawed feet that occasionally dipped into the water as it hovered a few inches above the surface. Its hands had massive clawed fingers that came to a point that glistened as droplets of fog accumulated on their surfaces. The face was something I didn't even imagine could exist. It had the general shape of a man, but I could see that teeth, an entire mouthful of razor-sharp teeth that seemed to poke out at every angle. The eyes were the worst though. I could see a reflection of the smallest bit of white. It was sunken so deep into the thing's skull that I could barely make them out. It was staring right at me. When I slammed the boat into drive, I could see it quickly move towards me with superhuman speed. I looked away, right at my feet, but that's when I heard it whisper,
"I'm right here. There's nothing to be afraid of. You just need to look at me. It will all be over quick."
The voice seemed to be in my head. It was crystal clear, not background noise. No loud boat engine, no wind roaring past. Just the most inhuman voice I've ever heard in my entire life.
"You've already looked for longer than most. I just need a few more seconds, and you won't even remember. This will all be a dream. You won't have to look again. Just once."
I felt Grandpa telling me to go quicker, but it was so tempting to look. There was a strange allure to the whole offer. If I just looked, I knew I wouldn't be afraid. I knew the ordeal would be done. I managed to continue staring at my feet as I tried to guide myself home as quickly as I could while using only my peripheral vision. I knew I was close to the dock, so I steered as best as I could to where Grandpa had once dredged the rocks out. Very quickly, I realized that I'd missed the mark as the prop struck bottom and quickly killed the engine. The boat, in short order, hit the bank, threw me to the damp earth, and I clawed my way to a standing position and ran hunched over in pain into the house. Within seconds, I was in Grandpa's old bedroom, clutching my chest in pain where I'd landed hard on a rock. Unlike the event that happened so many years ago, I felt like it had followed me. As I leaned forward and put my ear to the door to listen, I heard only silence. As I was about to calm down, I suddenly heard it.
Come out, just for a second. Come out."
I shuddered backwards and into the open closet. My hand grabbed the coat rack for support, but it wasn't meant to hold a grown man, and it pulled down effortlessly, spilling a box that was on the shelf above in the process. Among the things scattered at my feet was a sealed envelope with my name on it. I quickly opened it, thinking on nothing other than fear, and found it to be from Grandpa. The note was pretty heartfelt and seemed to be unrelated to the thing until the last lines. "If you look for too long," it said, "the thing will have you. The demon will take you. If you get on land before that, however, you will be okay. Just don't look at it. I'm sorry. I don't know more. If you can see it with a mirror, it will leave. I've done it myself." I quickly rummaged through the bathroom cabinet for a handheld mirror, and upon finding one, I opened the bedroom door out into the house. I couldn't see anything. I looked all around the large living area while walking backwards and saw nothing out of the ordinary. The kitchen was the only room left. I opened the door, but it was there. It was floating slowly towards me as it dragged one enormous clawed hand along the wall. As quickly as I could, I slammed the door shut and ran back into the bedroom. I looked through the letter again quickly for anything that might help. The back of the letter had something erased on it, but I could still make out the handwriting. "If it stays with you while on land, you have seen it too much. It will not leave. I'm sorry." I can hear the claw as it drags on the wall. It's still here, still coming, waiting. It just needs me to look for a little longer, then this will all be over. Everything will be over. This
"Will be easy."